Okay, guys, welcome back to part two of Cell Origins. This is your host, Mr. Hinson. Now, we're going to kind of take off just exactly where we left off last time. We were just discussing how cells can only come from division of pre-existing cells, and we were looking at the idea of a virus and the fact that it can't reproduce itself. It has to enter a host cell and reproduce via the host DNA. And we said that even though viruses aren't cells, they are kind of similar and they're very much smaller, and yet they're not able to reproduce themselves. So it's just further evidence for this idea that cells can only be formed by division of cells that already exist. Okay, so moving on, where are we up to? Yeah. Right, so just before I start talking about what this last slide is looking at, first of all, let's look, okay, hopefully you'll remember that each of us in every cell in our body, we have a genetic code, except within our sex cells. We still have some of that genetic code in our sex cells, but just not all of it. So we all have this genetic code, and we call that genetic code DNA, and it forms this kind of double helix structure. So you've got a sugar phosphate backbone, which makes up this kind of part, and you've got the two kind of bases, which are these parts here. What happens then, as we mentioned at the start earlier, is that the DNA is first of all copied into what we call RNA, or messenger RNA, as it's more specifically called, and that process is called transcription. And then the messenger RNA is changed into amino acids. And each of these is an amino acid. Of course, when they're put together and bonded together, they make a polypeptide, or what we call commonly known as a protein. All right, so that's how proteins basically in our bodies are made, via this process from DNA into RNA and into polypeptides and proteins. But something very, very key to remember is that we've got things that we call a codon. Now, a codon itself is a series of three bases. So you can see 1, 2, 3 corresponds to 1, 2, and 3. Now, each three bases is what we call a codon. Okay, it's a triplet group of bases on our DNA that we call a codon. Now, when that's transcripted, we get a single strand of messenger RNA. So you get the opposite. So where you've got a G, here you get a C. Where you've got a T, here you get an A. Where you've got a T here, you get an A. Remember, because they always join together. So this is like a template opposite for this, or basically it's these over here. Okay. Now you can see this three-letter grouping. Okay, that is the codon, or the code for glycine. Okay, CUC is the codon for leucine, and so on. You don't need to remember those, but you just need to remember what a codon is. So this is just more evidence of this idea that cells can only be formed by the pre-division of pre-existing cells. So what do I mean by that? So the genetic code we know is universal, and each of the 64 codons, or possible codons, okay, that are available, produces the same amino acid in translation, regardless of whatever organism it is. So whether you're a human, or an ant, or a bacterium, this triplet codon, or this codon, makes the same amino acid. Therefore, the logical deduction is that all the cells have arisen as the result of the same, of cell division from a single common ancestor. So that basically we all evolved from the same common ancestor. Now, it's important to remember that there are some minor variations that are likely to accrue since the common origin of life on Earth, but those events are very, very rare, and most of the genetic code is common between us most of the time. Okay. So this brings us up to a pretty key point in our discussion. So I want to get across the idea that if we accept that there were times in the history of the Earth where cells did not exist, then it's an obvious point that the first cells that arose on Earth must have come from non-living material, because there was nothing to make those cells. So the only possible explanation, apart from that, is of course that these cells were transported here from somewhere else in the universe. So as illustrated, it's extremely difficult, and given our level of technology, currently impossible to generate cells from anything but other cells. So how did those first cells arise? Some of the key problems with this idea, of course, that of how these cells arose is that non-living synthesis of simple organic molecules like sugars, amino acids, and fats. How did that happen if there weren't living organisms to synthesize them? And how did they assemble these organic molecules into polymers or long-repeating chains? How did they form? Where did the formation of polymers that can self-replicate come from? And when we mean self-replicate, we mean make more of themselves. So we're talking about the molecules of DNA. Where did membranes come from? Okay, well, the formation of membranes to package these organic molecules up into. So these are some of the problems that we're facing. Okay? All right. Now, if we do accept this idea that the first cells arose from non-living materials, there has to be a method or a way that they were produced. Okay, now, when we're going back hundreds of thousands of years ago, we can say that the Earth's atmosphere was reducing. Okay, so what we mean by that is it didn't contain any oxygen gas until after plants started photosynthesizing. Now, remember at this time there wasn't any bacteria, let alone any plants or animals on the planet. Okay, so at that time the atmosphere was non-reducing, there was no oxygen available. So all these molecules of gas, these are things which were floating around. Now maybe you'll be able to recognize these, maybe you won't be able to recognize them. So we can go through them one by one. If you want to have a think about them now, just pause the video for a second and you can start just thinking about what they might be. So pause there. Okay, so as you can see, this one up here is hydrogen, very, very small, the smallest of all our elements. We've got nitrogen, we've got water vapor here, so H2O, H, and oxygen, which is this red molecule in the middle. We've got methane, okay? So methane is made up of carbon in the middle, this big grey molecule, okay? And then we've got four hydrogens around it, making CH4. We've got ammonia, okay, which is NH3, remember? N being the blue molecule in the middle. And here we've got hydrogen sulfide. So this big yellow molecule is sulfur, and of course these little white ones are hydrogen. Hopefully you might have recognized them, maybe you did recognize some, not all of them. So most of these gases came from the amount of abundant volcanic activity that was going on the planet at that time, okay? There were fissures deep in the earth releasing these gases, both under the oceans and above the oceans, okay? Remember the oceans at the time were very, very shallow, and sort of they had this name, a primeval soup, okay, which was the name we gave to these very, very shallow oceans. There were volcanoes on the land, so there were volcanoes spewing out these gases from their top. So this idea of a primeval soup, so the shallow oceans were laden with these chemicals, they sort of reacted to form